Welcome everybody to today's session that is part of our Digital Credentials Summit, Creating Comprehensive Learner Records, Why You Need to Care About Non-Credit Learning Experiences at Colleges and Universities. We're so glad that you're here, and I will turn it over to our speaker for today. Thanks for being here.
Well, hi everyone, I'm Julie Uranis, and as promised, this is the session on non-credit learner data. So today we're going to talk, and I'm emphasizing non-degree learner data, the exclusion of non-credit experiences from a lot of our student information systems, and really why we should care and why we should consider all learners as students in our post-secondary institutions. And so let me start off by framing this conversation. So when we think about comprehensive learner records, it's sort of troubling to think that for us to realize an actual comprehensive learner record or comprehensive learner and employment record, we might be hampered by the simple fact that many or most post-secondary institutions don't really have a way to produce a true comprehensive record of all learning achieved at their institution. So we've designated our registrars as the central point of contact for the documentation of learning. And but while they may be positioned as that authority, they may not actually have access to the systems or have knowledge of all learning that's achieved on their campuses. It may be limited to just those 4 credit experiences or things that are counted by the credit hour. In terms of scope, when we have learning that's not being included in any type of comprehensive learner documentation, we don't really have a sense of the scope, the impact, and the reach. And we're reporting degrees, we're reporting in terms of our degrees. So can we actually say that someone with an undergraduate degree in history who took a non-credit coding boot camp that's not noted anywhere on their learner record, that they in fact got that job at Google because of their history degree? We can't find evidence necessarily of that coding boot camp anywhere on their learner record, and yet that's exactly where they find themselves in terms of their career. It aligns with the position that they sought. So in terms of really understanding what's going on in terms of that career and education alignment, we may not be seeing the full story here. And finally, funding. We say often, if it matters, it counts. And if it counts, the federal government may be paying for it, right? But if we're not reporting non-credit experiences, how are we ever going to see changes in Title IV funding to be more inclusive of more diverse learning experiences? If the federal government doesn't have any idea of that learners are achieving non-degree credentials at our institutions, then how are we going to make progress on educational reforms? And finally, tracking and engaging students across a lifetime. Many learners never enroll in a 4-credit experience at a post-secondary institution, and yet they may have repeated engagements in that non-credit space. From a town and gown perspective, as well as institutional advancement perspective, which means donations, this is a huge lost opportunity for us. So here's what we know, okay? Credential Engine has done an exceptional job at trying to make sense of the credential marketplace by counting what's out there. In their latest report that was just released not too long ago, we're approaching nearly 1 million credentials. We know the existence of nearly 1 million credentials, but we really don't know how many people are achieving these credentials, the counts of each. Now, the Student Clearinghouse and IPEDS, they're both incredible data sources for higher education, but there's often no mandate either from at the institution level, the state level, the federal level, for institutions to report non-credit credentials, and likely they're not doing so. So that brings me to LinkedIn. How many times have you liked someone's post when they announce an achievement? Often people will link or post to something on their profile, and it's shocking to think that the only digital footprint that someone's achievement might have is a self-reported post. Think about it. If they achieved something and it doesn't appear on a learner record anywhere, then where is it? How do we document it? How do we validate it and verify it? So I'm going to give you an example and demonstrate the gaps that exist because they're important ones. Now, if it's not immediately evident from my accent, I am native of Michigan, so I often rely on Michigan schools as my examples. So we're going to look at a Michigan school. And I've redacted all the information because I'm not criticizing the school. I'm just showing, I want to demonstrate the gaps that exist. So at many institutions, they have an incredible catalog, and the catalog serves to document degrees, certificates, for credit learning experiences. It lists student policies, programs of study, et cetera, okay? But what this school does not have and does not do is they don't really do much in terms of noting the programs that exist in the non-credit space within that student catalog. It's a wholly separate entity within the institution. So then when we look at the non-credit unit, they list the certificates that they offer on their website. And I have two examples, one in safety and one in cybersecurity. And that cybersecurity is a substantial one. It's 60 hours. Now, when we look at the institution, we zoom out a little bit. Let's take a look at what they're reporting in terms of the Workforce Investment and Opportunity Act, in terms of being an education training provider, okay? These are ETPL lists, or the ETPL, which is the Education Training Provider List. And those are maintained by the state, right? When we look at this particular institution, they are not even listing all of their degree programs, much less even including their non-credit programs. So, okay, fine, there's a gap. They're not reporting it to the state, okay. And we don't find it in their systems, all right. But why is listing non-credit programs that lead to jobs important in terms of this ETPL site? Well, here's why. Because lacking any information from the Student Clearinghouse and IPEDS, when we go, let's go back to our friends at Credential Engine, they use those ETPL lists to collect and count the credentials that exist in the US. We saw these two credentials at this institution don't exist in the university catalog or on the ETPL list, and they're likely not reported to IPEDS or the clearinghouse. So, and further, and this is just a nuance, not a slight on Credential Engine, but in their methodology, they mentioned certificates offered by non-Title IV institutions, but I couldn't find evidence of a methodology for non-Title IV certificates offered by Title IV institutions, especially since they're often not reported anywhere. So there's a gap there, and it's really anyone's guess as to how big that gap really is. So let me say this, Credential Engine is doing an incredible job, but this is an ecosystem failure. We can't expect Credential Engine or anyone really to fill these gaps on the back end, because that's what it is. It's at the back end. We really need to solve these and look at these from a holistic standpoint. So what do we know about learner data, non-degree learner data, non-credit learner data, and why is it housed outside of our central information systems? Well, often student information systems, they're just not designed for the data required or the functionality of professional continuing and online units. Let's think about this. If I host a brown bag lunch and I bring in a speaker to talk about leadership or something, and it's open to the community, what am I doing? I'm probably asking about someone's dietary restrictions, perhaps if they need any assistance, and that functionality doesn't necessarily exist in our student information systems. They're not designed for event-specific type questions or to be modified to that level, right? Often we have legal waivers that we're requiring. So for example, I worked in a unit where we hosted a motorcycle safety course, and it went on for like 2 to 3 weeks. We had legal waivers that folks had to click off and sign, programming those each time because the waiver would change or something would change in terms of regulatory requirements, etc. We were doing that in a separate registration system. Further, our student information systems are really designed around the idea that there's a process, a selective process in bringing learners into our system. They're going to apply, they're going to submit transcripts and maybe essays or test scores, et cetera, and then they're going to fill out documents, they're FAFSA, and all these things come together to create that learner package. But in non-credit learning, we're really more, it's slightly more transactional. Do you want to come to a motorcycle safety course? Great. Do you meet these eligibility requirements? Super. Fill out this form, submit your payment, and you're in. It's far less cumbersome to do that in a system designed to do that than it is trying to make another system conform, okay? Lastly, and a very important point, is the fact that we don't have a common unit of measurement here. We know that our learning in for credit is documented by the credit hour, and Amy Leighton has been very kind to share with us the problematic nature of the credit hour. But in the non-credit space, we have continuing education units, which are typically 10 contact hours for each unit. We have contact hours, we just have simply hours. And the dominant unit in most student information systems is the credit hour. So everything else is kind of an exception to that. And when you have an entire entity that is essentially an exception, it makes things difficult. It makes, you all know that exceptions are difficult to manage, right? So how are we to pull all this data together? Well, I would offer this. We need to consider that non-credit students are in fact students of our institutions. They may not have a student ID number, or maybe they should, but fundamentally they are students. The feds believe they're students because they're covered by FERPA. And you'd be surprised at how many folks are surprised at the idea that both credit students and non-credit students are covered by FERPA. A student is considered anyone who you retain educational records on at your institution. That is most definitely our non-credit students, okay? From a liability standpoint, they're coming onto our campuses. Many of these students, for example, you come onto campus for a brown bag lunch on leadership, and I would expect that you would adhere to the campus policies of, not bringing alcohol on campus, maybe not carrying a loaded firearm, etc. But those policies typically are noted in that student catalog for credit students. Those policies aren't always conveyed in that non-credit space, and that's a problem. And lastly, as I referred to earlier, affiliation with the institution, actually having a connection to the institution, and for a whole host of things, not only just donations, but support in general, that town and gown connection. These definitely are our folks. They have trusted us with guiding them through an educational experience. So whether it's non-credit or credit, it's still a valid experience for that individual. So there are other issues that we need to think about in terms of non-credit students. And it's just beyond considering them students. We actually need to treat them as such and provide the services they need to be successful learners. So many of us have been involved in that move from in-person courses, experiences into this remote space, right? And as we moved our programs online for credit students, we found a host issues around access, both for our instructors as well as our students. Don't assume that those same access points or issues are any different for our non-credit students. And further, they're just as vulnerable, okay? So when it comes to accessibility, when it comes to career services, folks are arriving on our campuses, either non-credit or credit, for that social mobility piece, for that career advancement piece, whether it is in non-credit or credit. And to have services that support them in those moves, in that mobility is important. But it's important that it's sensitive to the learner. So I'll use myself as an example. If Julie Uranis with a PhD went to a coding boot camp and decided one day, I'm going to chuck everything, I really want to move into coding. How would a career services person talk to me about that move? And if I was kicked over to the university's career services unit, how would they speak to me as someone who has an obnoxious 12-page CV, a PhD, and layering a coding certificate on top of that? Would they still tell me, oh, you should probably limit your resume to 2 pages? I don't know if they do that still, but that was the advisement I got when I was leaving my undergrad, and should be really focused on your cover letter. How would they address my needs as someone who's more mature than most of their advisees? And how would they address my career change? That's something to think about. And also, we need to think about our tech vulnerabilities. Our non-credit learners, they need help navigating technology. They may or may not be in the same learning management system that your help desk supports. So what help desk is supporting them? We also have to think about the technology that we're using from an ed tech perspective. They're covered by FERPA. So depending on what you're using, we need to look at that FERPA compliance of our vendors in that non-credit space. This is all part of the university, and yet often it doesn't get the same attention because they're non-credit students. So creating connections is critical, and we need to have a holistic view of our learners. So what this means, this is a huge shift for higher education. We have some really big companies that manage student data, but we need to be looking at some of the smaller ed tech companies that house non-credit registration data or non-credit learner data. Further, institutions need to change their thinking about professional continuing and online ed. I challenge you, those of you in higher ed, or those of you that work for higher ed or engage with higher ed institutions, I'd like you to do an informal audit of the institutions that you work at or with. Is there evidence of non-credit credentials being offered at that institution? Can you find them reported anywhere? You'll soon see what I mean about these gaps. Until we fix this, we will continue to just have case studies about non-credit to credit pathways instead of it being the norm in education. These barriers exist, and while they exist for a reason, right, from an institutional or an accreditation perspective, from a learner perspective, they're artificial barriers. Fundamentally, this is an ecosystem problem. So my challenge to you is that anytime you see certificates or credentials reported, acknowledged, or even discussed, I want you to dig a little deeper on that. I want you to ask the question, are these credit certificates? Are these for credit credentials? Or are they non-degree credentials? And if they're non-degree credentials, ask how that entity acknowledges or counts or reports those non-degree credentials as I've described today. My fear is that you will start to see those gaps. It's until we as a domain, as a sector, start looking at those gaps and probing at them. Until we do that, we're not going to make any progress on this. I'm going to go back to a session. It was a few years ago at this event when we were in Arizona, and I think it was someone from a Chamber of Commerce. And the question was, how do you validate that someone has a credential on their resume? How do employers do this? And that person answered, well, often they don't. They take it at face value on what's on a resume. I'm glad they do that because actually in a lot of instances, there would be no way to validate that credential and to verify that learner actually has that credential. Because if it's not reported through the clearinghouse, if it's not appearing on a transcript from an institution, it's really just the learner's claim that they make on their LinkedIn, on their Facebook, maybe on their resume. But once employers start thinking about that verification and start actually doing that, I think we might see a little bit of movement around this because the first call will be made to a registrar, and a registrar will say, what do you mean Julie Uranis has a 60-hour cybersecurity certificate? I show that Julie Uranis has a PhD and she has a master's from our institution, but that's it. I don't know what, I'm not sure what you're talking about. And then it weaves its way through the institution. And then there's a conversation about what's going on in our spaces that are not documented in our student information system. And that's at the point where maybe one institution changes. That needs to happen across the United States at however many thousands of institutions are out there that are doing this. And that's the challenge, my friends. And that's why you, I hope, will care just a little bit more about our non-credit learners and our non-credit learner data, because it is an important area. Our learners value it. Our learners value it enough to where they've engaged, they've registered for it, and our institutions need to value it just as much and document it as a valued experience. So my friends, in closing, I'd like to say this, and then I'll address questions. Mark Luba and I have been talking back and forth for some time now about, we should really focus on this. We should do something. So look for us to do that. This presentation is, if nothing, it's planting a flag for the two of us, putting a pin in this topic to say we want to and need to do more in this space. And so friends, if you're interested in being involved, if you're just like, hey, Julie, I just want to talk about this, you have my email address. I am the only Julie Uranis around, so I'm not hard to find if you search for me on Twitter or LinkedIn, or if you happen to lose my email address, trust me, you can find me, friends. So if you'd like to be engaged in this, if this has piqued your interest, I do hope we stay in contact in one way or another. So with that, I will pause. I will stop my share, and I will go over to our chat and our Q&A. And thank you all so much. Michael, thank you for your observation about Credential Engine's latest tally. It is pretty amazing, is it not? I think that's pretty incredible. Michelle, thank you so much for noting, summarizing what you're working on. Michelle, do you mind contributing where you're at so we can know where you're from, and maybe talk a little bit about this? I don't know if we can put you on screen. Oh yeah, great.
I can hear.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yes. Okay. So I'm from the University of British Columbia, and we've been doing non-credit learning for some time, and now we have our new campuses. We're just coming through on this to try to figure out what some of the policy frameworks are, those kind of things. So all of these things, it's like where the rubber hits the road is the student or the learner, regardless of how you look at this, they believe they are interacting and engaging with the institution. So, and the institution is one thing. It is not a component of, we see this in a lot of different contexts in universities, is that people see the institution as the institution, not as a department inside of an institution. So it's interesting. But what we're trying to do right now is methodically work our way through and kind of say, okay, from the academic policy perspectives, what are the things we're looking at? What is relevant out of our existing policies? What do we need to add? How do we modify? Same thing with our technology systems. So as we move into this world where we are kind of saying, if we look at the 60-year curriculum, which some people, I think that's a term people have been using for, or the lifelong learning continuum, we want to be able to kind of engage along the way. And for me, it's actually really important from looking at our current students and really surfacing and helping them to understand what skills they are gathering along the way. And we've heard so many different aspects of this in the conference and so many good talks on it. But as you move through and you kind of surface those, that we want to try and make sure that we are looking at our communities, whether they are local or global, understanding what their needs are, everything from the technology systems that we have through to, as you said, when they come on campus, what happens? So I think a lot of the things that are going on right now, prior to 2020, we were bringing people on campus and they were going off campus. And the footprint was not necessarily a digital footprint.
Mm-hmm.
Now it is, because many of the things that we're doing and offering are to a wider audience. So all of those things. So hallelujah, sister. Got ya. So.
Well, Wonder, I'm so appreciative of your comments, because it is, there is a need to truly document and to inform our learners. And you're right. I mean, if I were to get a non-credit certificate from Harvard University through their extension, right, I would be super geeked and put that all over my LinkedIn. And I would, and I would definitely boast, yes, I have a certificate from Harvard, or I have a Yale, name Stanford, doesn't matter. I mean, any institution really. And the fact that I potentially, and I'm not saying that Harvard is worse or better than anyone else, but potentially the only claim that exists may be me saying that I have it, because maybe it gets, certificate gets mailed to me, I get a congratulations, something like that. And I'm not criticizing, any one particular institution. I use Harvard as an example, but to know that, at times, non-credit students may not have a full sense of what policies apply to them, and what and possibly what they need to be mindful of when they walk on our campus it's difficult, because there's a lot of different policies that, our regents, boards of governors, whatever, they've enacted policies for our institution, and yet sometimes those are not conveyed to non-credit students. So that's on the student side, but yet the student still is on campus attending and feels that affiliation with your institution. And to know that they would not necessarily be considered a student because they don't come through the admissions process, I think would be troubling for those learners, and also kind of a little deflating, because they're happy to be affiliated. They purchase something from you. They want to engage with your institution, and yet we're saying, no, you're not the same. So Michelle, I don't have a handy checklist of these considerations, but I'm happy. I can upload my presentation, I think, into the app so that y'all have it. And then we can continue a conversation. Michelle, I'd love to connect with you. And really anyone else, seriously. It would be lovely to have this conversation. Like I said, Mark and I have been poking around at this and kind of thinking about this idea for some time. We think that it is such an ecosystem and such a big problem that we need kind of almost, there needs to be a little bit of a groundswell around it. So the more people involved would be great. And so, yes, it's almost, I think this is a call to arms for all the folks that are in professional continuing and online learning, but also folks that are data people and folks that are embracing this comprehensive learner transcript. I think it's important that we acknowledge that there are gaps in our data, and let's not force or try to have credential engines solve this for us. They can't. That's the wrong way to look at this. They don't need to improve their methodology and try to collect more. What we need to do is be better at pushing out that information so that they can acknowledge it. So friends, I'm so happy to have been here with you. I think we ran a little bit over, but we started a little bit later. So thank you all for sticking around for these last few minutes. And I think once again, you've got my email in the chat if you're interested in connecting.
Thank you so much, Julie, and thank you to our attendees for being here. We hope that you'll check out our sessions throughout the remainder of today, and thank you for being here. Hopefully we'll see everybody in person next year at this event. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.